Chapter 6: An Incident and Its Consequences. On January 22nd, I drove to Nairobi in convoy with John Baxendale, who was helping George with lions. I went ahead in my new 6-cylinder Land Rover with one of George's staff in the back. I had covered half the distance when, climbing up a long hill where the road was freshly gravelled and cut along the sides of a steep slope, which ended in a river far below, I came around a bend and saw two Africans walking in the middle of the road, a few hundred yards ahead. There was plenty of time for them to respond to my honking, but they ignored it and walked on hand in hand until I had no choice but to drive the car near the escarpment edge in order to avoid them. Here the gravel was still very loose and the car skidded and hit a milestone. The next thing I knew was that I was laying halfway down the escarpment in a mass of broken glass a few yards from the smashed up car. My first thought was about the African. After I had caught his name, I saw him struggling from the car, thank God, with no worse injury than a scratch on his forehead. This was incredibly lucky, as the car had overturned and was facing in the opposite direction from which we had come. It must have somersaulted while plunging down the slope. What was still luckier was that it had been entangled by a few bushes halfway down, otherwise we would have rolled into the river at the bottom. I now tried to get up, but found it difficult because of the pain, which seemed to go all through me. Also, my right hand was a mess of blood and earth. Helped by the African, I clambered up the 80 yards to the road and sat down. My hand was bleeding severely, and I could only bear the pain by holding it upright. After a while, a bus appeared, carrying among the African passengers the local chief. Kindly he poured some iodine from his first aid kit onto my hand. I felt no reaction to the normal burning sensation of the medicine. This made me fear the worst. The chief offered to take us to the nearest dispensary. While I was being helped into the bus, John Baxendale caught up with us. Taking in the situation at a glance, he arranged with the chief for a guard to look after the car until the police could investigate the accident. Then he drove us to the provincial headquarters at Embu, 80 miles away, which we had to pass on our way to Nairobi. I was most grateful to John for carefully avoiding all the bumps on the road and yet trying to go as fast as possible because I could not stop the bleeding on my hand, which left puddles of blood everywhere. At the African hospital in Embu, the dresser gave me an injection against tetanus, some pain-killing tablets, and a blanket to keep me warm and to stop my teeth from chattering with shock. And then he assured me that my African passenger had only superficial scratches and could go home the next day. After providing him with money to buy food and his return ticket, we left him. We went on for another 80 miles to Nairobi. By 9 p.m., when we reached the hospital, 6 hours had elapsed since the accident, and I was in a bad state. It was most fortunate that my old friend and surgeon, Mr. Gerald Neville, was available to do the operation immediately. It took 3 hours. Although my body was one bruise and all the colors of the spectrum, I had no really serious injury other than that my right hand. The skin on the back of the hand was gone, all the tendons were severed, and all bones had been knocked about half an inch out of alignment. For the time being, all that could be done was to place a skin graft over the hand. When this had healed, new tendons would need to be transplanted from my leg to my hand, which would mean another operation in about 6 months' time. During the following months, in hospital, I had plenty of time to reflect on how lucky I had been to survive this accident, and thought of this whenever I felt depressed at knowing that it would take at least 2 years and several operations before I might perhaps recover the use of my right hand. Of course, there was no question of talking over the two leopard's cubs, which would be far too big for rehabilitation in a few months. My most urgent need was to find somebody to help me with Cheetah, as well as with more personal chores such as dressing, bathing, cutting food, and the other things I could no longer do myself. It was fortunate for me that at this time a young American, Mary, arrived in Kenya, urgently wanting a job. Preferring to work with animals and live in a bush, she fitted in with my needs, and moreover she could also type and drive a car. So we arranged for her to get a working permit, which under these circumstances was granted to a non-Kenya citizen. Meanwhile, George and John had taken turns driving local, and Stanley the long distance to the cheetah, who had remained far more than 2 weeks around the photo tree. They had moved gradually nearer the camp until they settled at the Kil Akatsea, about half a mile across the river. This was the nearest Pippa had brought these cubs to the camp, although she had used the Kil Akatsea frequently with Billy, Whitey, and Tatu. This tree had the great advantage that the cheetah could rest and feed under its shade without being seen by vultures, who by circling around might give them away to other predators. Also, the lower branches were an ideal lookout over the surrounding plain, and the cheetah could easily spot a car arriving at my camp and thus keep clear of strangers. The men saw the family, with the one exception, daily, and so felt sure that Pippa had not killed during my absence. When Mary and I returned on February 22nd, exactly 1 month after the accident, Pippa had taken the cubs earlier that morning to the road about a mile from camp. During the next few days, they continued to move until she discovered a newly dug gravel pit on the Vasarongi, 5 miles upstream. The park warden had recently decided to move the headquarters from Leopard Rock to a place not far from there, and needed gravel to surface the new site. For the time being, the road work had stopped, and so the cheetah were the kings of the large pit, where they found an ideal playground in its many piles and trenches. I felt apprehensive as to how the family would react to Mary, who was driving the car, and we decided that she should not leave the Land Rover until they had got used to her presence. To make our reunion easier, we had brought along a complete ship. Soon after I had honked the familiar signal, the family appeared. Ignoring my white-bandaged arm and foot, the cubs bounced on their carcass while Pippa sat by watching them, pulling and tearing at the skin in their efforts to open it. I sat next to her, caressing her while she purred and licked my hand. How often had I thought of doing it just while I was in the hospital. Now I felt so happy knowing that she was so glad that we were together again. The cubs were in excellent form, despite having by now lost all their deciduous teeth. I could see that their permanent canines had grown to millimeters. They were now 7 months old and 10 days. During the teeth-changing period, they had great difficulty in chewing, let alone opening a carcass, and I felt very sorry for them as I watched them dancing frantically around the sheep and tackling it ceaselessly, until after 10 minutes, Big Boy succeeded in tearing it open at the tail. Now Pippa thought it time to share the meal, and for the next 2 hours I listened to the cubs fighting over the meat, chewing and crunching bones. I wondered why I loved these noises, as people's eating noises irritate me. Was it that animals eat only to sustain their life, while our habit of using meals as a part of social entertainment, at which rigid rules concerning table manners prevail, forbids such noises? I was glad to see that my long absence had not changed the cub's trust in me. Somba tried to charge, but after I said a firm no, she settled down and even allowed me to dangle intestines into her mouth. Big Boy needed no help and gobbled up with gusto everything the others refused. Only Tiny still required coaxing and went without food rather than fight for it. Suddenly, 3 ostrich appeared far off. Instantly, the cheetah all sat up, growled, and watched with their eyes as the birds continued walking slowly on their way. They only began to eat again when one of them kept watch until the ostrich disappeared. Soon after, I was startled by the jarring engine vibration of a tractor 500 yards away. To my surprise, the cheetah ignored this noise completely, just as they never took any notice of an aircraft. Mary had remained all morning at the driver's seat, and after a short inspection by Pippa, seemed accepted. Next morning there was no sign of a family. I felt rather relieved, as we had run out of meat and I had only milk to offer them. Later in the day I took 3 friends from the United States for a drive in a park. On our way we stopped once more at a gravel pit, where we found the cheetah right in the open, apparently waiting for us. My friends, of course, remained inside the car while I held out the milk bowl to the cubs, who in their eagerness pushed all 3 heads in together and nearly spilled the contest. It was especially difficult for me to hold the bowl with my left hand only, so I hoped that Mary could soon make friends with the family and be able to help in feeding them. Next day I had a treat for the cheetah, the meat of a buffalo which had been shot uncontrolled. It always puzzled me why Pippa's families were so very fond of buffalo and zebra meat, since both were animals which they would not have been able to kill, except if they were very, very young. But they became quite crazy when we gave them the meat and filled themselves to bursting point. Somba especially ate more than I believe she could hold, and was fiercely at loggerheads with Pippa over the best tidbits. Watching to see that nobody could get more than she still found time to charge me twice when I refilled the water container, so I stopped her with a no each time. After she was unable to eat any more, she sat close to me, watching me intensely. We were no more than a few inches from each other, so I risked being ripped open. I stood her long and scrutinizing gaze, which seemed to be a challenge as to which of us would be the future boss. I kept completely still, just looking at her for a long, long time, until in fact she rolled over and relaxed. More than ever, I felt that Somba was fierce only when her territorial and food defense instincts were aroused. Once she realized that neither was threatened, she became as placid as her brothers. Big Boy could never be provoked and was incredibly tolerant and very self-assured. The 2 other cubs were rarely at loggerheads with him, though they often were with Pippa. But now the family was far too full of buffalo meat for any quarrels, and rested panting with their heavy bellies in the air. I thought this was a good opportunity for introducing Mary, and so I signaled her to join us. Slowly, she set herself near me, while on my other side Pippa dozed. I patted Pippa, and gradually Mary did the same until Pippa was being stroked only by her. Somba watched with half-closed eyes, ready to defend her mother, but when she saw her so at ease, she too relaxed. We all had a peaceful sleep during the midday heat until Pippa thought in time to move. Followed by Big Boy and Tiny, she walked slowly off with swinging belly, while Somba, who had eaten more than any of them, searched for still more meat until she found a chunk too big for her to grab, so she straddled it away. Unbelievable as it appeared, she still seemed hungry the next day and followed me whenever I gave meat to the others to make sure she was not done out of her share. Otherwise, she was very friendly, never once attacked me, and seemed now to accept me as a boss. Poor Tiny was off color, sitting with a very distant belly. He did not touch the food that I offered, but instead chewed grass. I always watched the faces of cheetah, so I knew that none of them had worms, which might have been responsible for stomach trouble, so I assumed that Tiny had only indulged in too much buffalo meat, and this must have been the cause of his indisposition, because the next day he was quite fit again. No mother could have had 3 children more different in characters and looks than Pippa had. I was daily more impressed to observe how she made allowance for each without provoking jealousy or upsetting them. During the last few days, she gradually moved back toward the photo tree, where we found them the following morning. Big Boy and Tiny seemed to have teething trouble and chewed bark or rubbed their gums against sticks, while Somba meanwhile made the best of the meat ration. Later, I photographed Tiny and Pippa sitting on a branch. Suddenly, Tiny uttered a strange, deep gargling sound, and the next moment all 3 cubs were off, bolting from a great bustard which Tiny had spotted far away. Pippa watched this large bird without changing her position, and so reassured the cubs returned again to finish their meal. A few days before, I had developed an infection on 2 toes, which have been operated on while I was in hospital. Since I was unable to walk, Mary and the men went along the day to the cheetah, whom they found at the photo tree. According to their reports, the family were feeding when Tiny again gave the alarm and all ran off some 50 yards. Then they stopped and watched Billy approaching from the opposite direction. When she had come within 100 yards of the car, Billy kept hiding behind it, with the result that the family cleared off and never returned. Local, obeying my instruction never to feed any of the previous cubs unless they were ill, collected the food remains and brought them back. As I was never present to identify Billy, I had to take Local's word that it had been Pippa who had given was today. The only explanation I could find for this was that the photo tree was right inside Billy's territory, and by now the ground was dry enough for Pippa to clear out of it. In the afternoon, a party of visitors called at my camp, among whom was a doctor. I consulted him about my tooth, and he advised me to get them treated at the hospital as soon as possible. It was fortunate that the warden had to fly the next day to Nairobi, and so I could get a lift which would save me the 9 hours trip by car. But I was less fortunate in being kept at the hospital for 2 weeks. From the diary notes Mary wrote during my absence, I learned that the family remained for another 10 days around the photo tree. They allowed Mary to hold the milk bowl while they pushed their heads in at all once. But it took a week before they really made friends. Pippa was the first to come to Mary and lay down at her feet, purring loudly while Mary stroked her. Meanwhile, Somba was very busy charging Stanley, trying to prevent him from removing the empty meat basket, hooking her teeth into it. They had a tug-of-war until she gave up and Elsa came near Mary. After examining her carefully, especially her hands, she settled close and thus encouraged Tiny to investigate too. He had been quick to realize that I was not there to hand feed him, so he had been fiercely at loggerheads with anybody who dared to take his meat and became so efficient in defending in that even Somba treated him with respect. One morning, only Pippa turned up at the photo tree. After a while, she called the cubs with a low moan, and then she got no response, guided Mary and two other men for half a mile to the Mulika, climbing two more trees on a way to call the cubs. Finally, they found them across the rivulet, and the party of 7 walked back to the meet, which was locked inside the car. All went well for 10 days, until early in the morning Mary drove the Land Rover to the photo tree. As soon as locals stepped out, 2 lionesses rose from the high grass about 50 yards away, but being wild, ran off quickly. Needless to say, the family had left the area and they could not be found for 5 days. Chapter 7. Growing Up. I returned during their absence and learned that a few days before, on March 9th, Boy had mauled the warden's child. Boy was one of George Lyon's. He and his sister, Girl, had acted major parts in our film Born Free. As soon as filming had been completed, they were presented by their owners to George to rehabilitate them in the wild. Later they were joined by Ugas and finally by 4 cubs, a lion and 3 lionesses. Despite the difference in their ages and backgrounds, all had amalgamated into one pride, so Boy and Girl kept very much together and had recently produced 2 cubs. Having been used to human company since they were very young, they were very friendly of the pride. The recent incident had taken place within a few hundred yards of the photo tree. John Baxendale had found Boy on the road, and in the hope of bringing him back to George Camp, 12 miles away, had allowed him to jump up on the roof of his Land Rover and had then continued his journey. They were met by a warden traveling in the opposite direction with his wife and 2 small children in the front seat of an open car. The warden stopped within a few feet of John's car and got out to have a chat. While they were talking, Boy got down from the roof of a Land Rover and slowly approached the warden's car. Thinking that he contemplated jumping onto his car, the warden got into the driver's seat with the intention of moving on. By this time, Boy was alongside and suddenly, rearing up, he leaned across the warden and seized the arm of a 4-year-old boy who was sitting between his parents. At this moment the car, which was already in gear, started and lurched forward, dragging Boy along, walking on his legs until he let go of the child's arm. Meanwhile, the warden was punching Boy with his fist, and the mother held on to her son and baby daughter on her lap. At no time did Boy show any sign of anger, as he certainly would have done at being thwarted of his prey. He had regarded the child as such. Although boy's teeth had sunk deep into the child's upper arm, there was no muscle torn and no bones broken. Being late on Sunday afternoon, there was unfortunately no aircraft available to fly the child to Nairobi Hospital. His father therefore took him by car to a mission hospital an hour's drive up in Naimbini Hills, where the child's wounds were dressed and sewn up. This was a great error, as wounds infected by a predator should never be completely closed but kept open to drain. By the following morning, the boy's arm was in a bad state, so everyone great relief when child recovered completely after 6 weeks in Nairobi Hospital. The incident aroused great controversy and publicity. The government ruled that boy could remain in the Meru Park on the condition that George should from now on refrain from entertaining visitors with any of his lions and should stop feeding them. Luckily, by now they could all look after themselves. About this time, a detailed program of how I was to be allowed to carry on my work with the cheetah was drawn up. This was in addition to our mutual agreement made long ago, which stated that I would now terminate their rehabilitation by end of this year. By that time, the cubs would be 17.5 months old, the same age that Pippa, previous leader, had been when she abandoned them. Now, as from October 1st, the goats had been removed from Kenya Mare and kept outside of the park, and the feeding of the cheetah was to be gradually reduced until December 1st, when it was to stop. When George and I had started rehabilitating our animals here 4 years earlier, we had built our camps 12 miles apart, assuming this to be far enough to keep the lions and cheetahs out of each other's territories. But recently, the lions had come more frequently into Pippa's area, which naturally interfered with her movements. So I was startled when the family appeared one midday right in my camp, for the first time since the cubs were born 8 months earlier. They were extremely nervous and watched with suspicion every move made by my staff, and this even though the men kept as far as possible of the camp. I placed the meat next to my sleeping hut at the opposite end and within a few feet of a tree bridge, so that the family could quickly retreat unseen in case a visitor arrived. The cubs were thin but not unduly hungry, so I assumed that Pippa must have killed at least once during the last 5 days. While I detected and caressed her, she purred affectionately and licked my hand. This seemed to put the cubs at their ease, and they soon started to eat. But we did not have enough meat to give them a good meal, and what we had was rather high, so after a short while Pippa took the cubs across the tree bridge to the Gumbo plain, from where they all returned at sunset. Meanwhile, we had got a fresh goat from Kenmari, onto whose carcass they now pounced greedily. While they fed, I sat close to the family, guarding them against possible predators. Everything was still around us, except for the rhythmic humming of the crickets and cicadas, which always started up their synchronized choir after dark, and the munching of the cheetah. Undoubtedly, the cheetah could hear far greater variety of sounds than we could, and they kept on listening into the night very tensely until it was well after 8 p.m., when they went off across the rivulet. A little later, 2 lions roared not far away. Pippa evidently regarded the camp as the safest place under the circumstances, for her reappeared next afternoon. So after they had started eating, John Baxendale drove up. Quickly, I sent Mary to stop him from coming near, but the cubs had already bolted over the tree bridge and only ventured back when Pippa called "Purr, purr,"